I'm reading a passage from Meridian by Alice Walker. There was, in the center of campus, the largest magnolia tree in the country. It was called the Sojourner. Classes were sometimes held in it. A podium and platform had been built into its lower branches with wooden steps leading up to them. The Sojourner had been planted by a slave on the Saxon plantation. Later, of course, Saxon College. The slave's name was Louvenie. Louvenie was tall, thin, strong, and not very pleasant to look at. She had a chin that stuck out farther than it should, and she wore black head rags that made a shelf over her eyebrows. She became something of a local phenomenon in plantation society because it was believed she could not smile. In fact, throughout her long life, nothing even resembling a smile ever came to her poked-out lips. In her own country, in West Africa, she had been raised in a family whose sole responsibility was the weaving of intricate tales with which to entrap people who hoped to get away with murder. This is how it worked. Her mother and father would be visited by the elders of the village, who walked the 2 miles to their hut singing the solemnest songs imaginable in order to move her parents' hearts and to make it easier for the spirits who hung around the hut to help them in their troubles. The elders would tell of some crime done in the village by a person of persons unknown. Louvenie's parents would ask a few questions. How was the person murdered? What was stolen other than their life? Where were the other villagers at the time, etc., all the while making marks on the floor of the hut with 2 painted sticks. The sticks had no meaning except as a distraction. Louvenie's parents did not like to be stared at. When the elders left, Louvenie's mother would change her face with paint and cover up her hair and put on a new dress and take up residence in the village proper. In a few days she would come back, and she and her husband would begin to make up a story to fit the activities of the criminal. When they completed it, they presented it to the villagers, who congregated in the dead of night to listen. Each person listening was required to hold a piece of treated fiber plant under his or her arm, snugly into the armpit. At the end of the story, these balls of fiber were collected, and from them Louvenie's parents were able to identify the guilty party. How they were able to do this, they never had the chance to teach her. On the Saxon plantation in America, Louvenie had been placed in charge of the kitchen garden. She was considered too ugly to work in the house and much too dour to be around the children. The children, however, adored her. When pressed, she would tell them stories of blood-curdling horror. They followed her wherever she went and begged her to tell them all the scary, horrible stories that she knew. She was pleased to do so and would tell stories that made their hair stand on end. She made up new American stories when the ones she remembered from Africa had begun to bore. She might have continued telling stories had there not occurred a tragedy in the Saxon household that came about through no real fault of her own. It had never been explained to her that the youngest of the Saxon children, an only son, suffered from an abnormally small and flimsy heart. Encouraged by the children to become more and more extravagant in her description, more pitiless in her plot, Louvenie created a masterpiece of fright, and bursting with the delight she always felt when creating, but never smiling at all, which seemed curious even to the children. She sat under a tree at the back of the garden just as the sun was sinking slowly through a black cloud bank in the west, and told the children the intricate, chilling story of the old man whose hobby was catching and burying children up to their necks and then draping their heads, which stuck up in rows like cabbages with wriggling eels dipped in honey. Long before the culprit received his comeuppance, young Saxon had slumped dead to the ground of a heart attack. He was 7 years old. Many, many years ago, on the banks of the Lalakak River in deepest Africa, there lived a man blacker than the night, whose occupation was catching little white children, those who had lost at least one tooth to the snags of time, and planting them in his garden. He buried everything except their heads. These he left above ground because he liked to hear them wail and scream and call for their mothers, who of course did not know where they were and never came. He fed them honey and live eels, still wriggling, that slipped through their lips and down their throats, while underneath their ears the eels' tails still struggled and slid. At night the children's heads were used as warming posts for the man's pet snakes, all of them healthy and fat and cold as ice and loving to flick a keen, quick tail into a snuffling, defenseless nose. The man used to laugh as he This portion of Louvenie's story was later discovered on a yellowed fragment of paper and was kept under glass in the Saxon library. It was in the childish handwriting of one of the older Saxon girls. Louvenie's tongue was clipped out at the root. choking on blood, she saw her tongue ground under the heel of Master Saxon. Mutely she pleaded for it, because she knew the curse of her native land. Without one's tongue in one's mouth, or in a special spot of one's own choosing, the singer in one's soul was lost forever, to grunt and snort through eternity like a pig. Louvini's tongue was kicked toward her in a hail of sand. It was like a thick pink rose petal, bloody at the root. In her own cabin she smoked it until it was as soft and pliable as leather. On a certain day, when the sun turned briefly black, she buried it under a scrawny magnolia tree on the Saxon plantation. Even before her death, 40 years later, the tree had outgrown all the others around it. Other slaves believed it possessed magic. They claimed the tree could talk, make music, was sacred to birds, and possessed the power to obscure vision. Once in its branches, a hiding slave could not be seen. The reason I chose this location right here is because this used to be as slave quarters, and it hasn't changed much. The inside probably has, but the outside still pretty much remains the same. And actually, most of the buildings on the historic horseshoe were built by slave labor. There's still lots of remnants of that, I feel, that you can kind of feel when you're walking around on this campus. I think it's a very historical, important place. All of the Civil War history and the slave history. And this location in particular, people actually lived here and stayed here, and their stories might have been the same as Louvini's. The reason I chose this passage was because I think all of the imagery and the importance of the storytelling is really beautiful and really important to us as a culture and a history. And on a college campus, lots of stories like that go around. And so I think just the whole idea of filming somewhere on campus, in particular a slave quarter, something that used to be a slave quarters, is just really neat. I feel like people generally don't view this as something embedded with so much rich history and something so sad and tragic like a slave quarters. They just see it as this fancy area behind the president's house because there's a really nice garden back there, and I'm sure the inside is really beautiful, and they probably have people over and they're like, oh, this is such a nice place. But when in fact it used to house slaves, and they probably weren't treated very nicely. Personally, I didn't really know so much about the history of this spot, and I know last year during Parents' Weekend we came back here, just like walked through the gardens, didn't know that, and then when it got time to do this project, I spoke with the principal of my dorm, Dr. Bobby Donaldson, and we had been talking about significant locations. And this was brought up, and it's just right here, and it's so crazy to think about. This way. This is how nice it is now. It's secret. Get a little peek in there. Super nice.